thank you, Joe and John. We really appreciate it. It was a great presentation. We'll look forward to getting into some of those continued questions then after the fact. Our next presentation looks at maintenance management. In R4, we have Jason Krasowitz, who's a regional sales manager. He's worked in software sales for over 15 years. And then we have Nick Sterniolo, who is a business process analyst too at Blue Mountain. Welcome, Jason and Nick. Thanks for presenting today.
Thank you, Drexel.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You should be able to go ahead and share your screen.
Yep. Yes. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Again, I am Jason Krasowitz. I am a regional sales manager here. And as Drexel said, I've been with Blue Mountain coming up on 4 years. This is now my 5th summit. But prior to that, I've been in the software sales, working at other organizations. It's actually more than probably closer to 18 years now. Nick, do you want to just give you a quick introduction?
I'm Nick Sterniolo. I'm business process analyst too, and I've been with Blue Mountain for just over 4 years.
So we're gonna dive into the maintenance functionality here in a little more detail than what Joe and John just kind of showed. And I think, you know, not to beat a dead horse here, but you know, I think it's even more visible in the maintenance functionality how we really did take customer feedback in developing the configuration and the new features and functionality and enhancements that the maintenance functionality within R4 brings. So, you know, just, you know, reiterating what Randy said yesterday and what people have been saying today, you know, that feedback is critical to us. Please keep it coming, and let it, you know, hopefully you do see and you understand that, you know, we are listening and hearing that feedback. So once we dive into the software, Nick and I are going to walk through, you know, a couple of examples and scenarios and really focus on certain aspects of the application where we feel really highlight what's, you know, either new or enhanced in the application. So, you know, one of the areas specifically from a corrective maintenance standpoint, we're going to be looking at work requests. And, you know, the couple of things that are really highlighting here are the ability to automatically create work orders off of a request instead of having to manually create those work orders, and the ability to create multiple types of work per request. Also, we're going to really dive a little bit deeper into what John had mentioned earlier, the additional workflows that have been added to the configuration, specifically this idea of a pre-approval workflow. Then on the preventative side, we're going to show you a few things, specifically, again, some of the highlights. We added this ability for a grace period. This is something, at least I know personally, I've heard many, many times as I'm talking to you and other customers about the ability, hey, you know, we have this, you know, leeway, you know, off of the due date. And, you know, in R3, you know, when something's past due, it's past due. And, you know, if you're using the best practices template, an NCR is automatically generated when something goes past due. So this ability to add on a grace period, and not only that, the ability to put in extension requests to update that grace period if you need. More flexibility around due date recalculation. We're going to talk a bit about that. Improvements to the work plan templates, and then again, some of the questions we just saw, I think we'll be able to highlight some of the things there. And again, just some more enhancements around parts and labor tracking. And then some other areas, I think, where we may not necessarily show today, but just so you're aware of them. You know, one thing, again, another thing we heard quite often is this idea of a route, you know, going around, we have to check all the fire extinguishers, whatever it might be within the facility. And, you know, with R3, it was possible, but maybe not as clean as we'd like it to be. So with R4, the ability to do that is going to be much enhanced and much improved. And again, really going back to this morning's presentation, which I really thought was excellent. I learned a tremendous amount myself during that presentation. But RAM, obviously, a lot of our customers currently are integrating RAM with other applications already. But this is certainly an area where, from a maintenance standpoint, integrating with a predictive, like an alarm system, might be something that is very advantageous and might be very beneficial to many of you listening in on the presentations. And then finally, we'll spend some time just looking at the spare parts and inventory functionality. Again, this is nothing, I think, dramatically new here. We've always had reorder points, bill of materials, like-for-like parts. But again, things like on the bill of materials, being able to now add parts to bill of materials from the parts record instead of having to go to each individual asset record to do it. Nice enhancement. Same with like-for-like parts. We'll show you where you're going to be able to really take advantage of that functionality. And again, another very common integration point that we see. I think we've mentioned it in the past, but with R4, we've basically removed the purchasing functionality that was in R3. We just didn't carry that forward. And really the reason for that was most of our customers were really not using it. Everyone is typically using some other system to purchase their parts, or their ERP system. As you heard on yesterday's presentation about kitting, they were using Oracle. So, this idea that, to create purchase requests and create purchase orders in RAM really wasn't being utilized very heavily. So from our perspective, we see this as a natural integration point moving forward. So when, a part hits its reorder point in RAM, that information can flow automatically to your purchasing system. And then, when that part comes in, you can pass that information back to RAM to replenish the inventory, et cetera. And just finally here, I did want to highlight a couple of the workflow diagrams. Again, you're probably very familiar with these types of diagrams, especially with our best practices configuration. So, this is just an example of the work request workflow that you would receive as part of the package if you went with our best practices configuration. And again, I think going back to highlighting what Joe showed in the beginning presentation, just from an ease of use standpoint and just having a better idea of where a record stands, those icons that are now built into the software are going to match the icons on these workflows. So you'll be able to kind of match up where in the workflow that particular record stands. Also, you'll see here, things like, again, we're going to talk about this idea of automatically creating work, from an approval, from a work request. If I just come over here, this particular workflow is our maintenance work with OneReview. Again, probably very similar to what you're probably used to. It goes from the open stage to the in progress stage to pending review. And one thing we did add and enhance is this idea of out for service. So that's something we'll talk about as well. But basically, it allows you, if you're outsourcing or sending a piece of equipment out for maintenance, to use this out for service stage. And what's nice as well is there's a field now on the asset record. So when the work record goes into out for service, that will show up in the asset record. So you can see that asset is out for service. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into R4. I already have it open here. And one thing we're going to talk about just a little bit before we jump into the actual maintenance functionality, again, after we were talking about listening to that presentation yesterday on hierarchies, of hierarchies within R4. I'm going to come over here to our plus button. Again, just from an ease of use and interface standpoint, it's just so much easier now to find things within the application. Instead of having to come up to the menu and look at that File Explorer window, that can be very overwhelming and daunting, at least for me. I can now click on my plus button here and look for what I'm interested in, whether it's a query or a chart, but I'm going to come down here to configuration and choose Tree Explorer. And now I've added the Tree Explorer to my workspace. And again, we're talking about all these different hierarchies. So, if we look at the system hierarchy, which is kind of more aligned with what we saw yesterday in the demonstration, and let's look at, we're going to stick with our water for injection system. So you can see here we have our root or parent record, and then all the child components that are associated with it. But one thing we did want to kind of highlight is this new hierarchy, this idea of a functional location hierarchy. And now you can see here, we have these functional locations. So if I come down here to this Media Prep 101, we have the temperature sensor 101.1. So this is the functional location, but we have this temperature transmitter. And I don't know if you noticed when Joe opened the temperature transmitter asset record in the previous presentation, there was actually a field that said functional location that associated with this temp sensor 101.1. So what it allows you to do is obviously change out different assets, but this functional location will always be the same. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, yeah, that was great.
Okay. So getting back to maintenance, let's look at our work request query. And again, we had that work request here that Joe just added. And you'll see it's in this pending approval state. Okay, he's got the image. So say I'm the person who is looking to approve this request. You can see here now, this area that I really want to highlight is where we can now automate the ability to create work. So in this case, maybe we want to create maintenance work and possibly even calibration work, because maybe after the piece of equipment is maintained, it has to be recalibrated. So this now allows you to create multiple types of work against a single request. And then we can come here and we can see all the different workflows that are available to me now when it comes to work. So again, some of these are going to be very familiar. We have a simplified rule, a 1 review rule, a 2 review rule, but we now added a 3 review rule because we heard from you that there were times and pieces of equipment where we needed 3 approvals or 3 reviews on work before that work order can be closed. But additionally, we now have these pre-approval workflows. So again, if this is an on-demand or corrective situation, perhaps your organization requires some sort of approval process before that work order can be generated and the work is actually completed. So we can use these pre-approval workflows to be able to do that. Okay, so I'm just gonna close out of that record. And I just want to come back to one that's actually been approved. this is a work request now that's in the approved state. Okay, and as we come down, we'll see that that create maintenance work is highlighted and the workflow. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick now just to talk a little bit more about that pre-approval process and the thought behind why we created it.
So one thing I'd like to add as well is upon signing and transitioning the record to the approved state, that record is automatically created, and it's using the pre-approval with one approval workflow. And so, Jason, if you want to pull up the diagram. So one of the areas missing, and I don't want to say missing, but we need to improve on for creating on-demand or corrective work, is we can control with a work request who are we creating work and who is able to create work and what are we creating work for. But that didn't give us the ability to control what's put on that corrective or on-demand work. So the pre-approval maintenance work allows us to create a work order where we can fill out the planning information, the templates associated, parts, labor, and then the user would sign it and it would go to its first approval, where that would be reviewed and then signed, or it would be sent back and we would indicate whether an incorrect template is being referenced. So if we need to do a corrective maintenance and this pump needs to be replaced, using the pending approval, workflow, we can control who says or who approves we can use this work order. Otherwise, in R3, it was we just create the maintenance work and we attach templates to it without any approvals for it. And then the record actually turns into or uses the workflow we indicate in the header. So, Jason, if we can go ahead and open a record.
You want to open the work order?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so just to highlight, so you'll see here when this was approved, here under associated work, here's that automatically generated work order. And I'll open that up.
So the first stage, it's created in is the approval planning. And this is where we would build out the work order. The first thing you'd want to fill out would be the workflow to assign to work. This is very similar to the event field where we determine how many reviews do we need after the work's completed. And so really with these pre-approval workflows, what we're doing is we're kind of taking the steps that we put into the event, right, where we're filling out that information on the event and then signing and approving the event to create work. When I was saying we're not creating work from an event, we're creating work on demand and corrective, but we still want the approvals to ensure that the correct work plans and other information are used. If you scroll down a little, well, first thing I also want to point out too is take note of the form layout. We land in the planning stage, and we'll see that as we progress through this maintenance work record and the other preventive work records, that these will change depending on what stage we're in. So Jason, if you want to go to approvals. So someone had asked if we can indicate who can approve. You can. In the pre-approver one approval field, we can indicate who we would want to be able to sign for this record. However, we also added the ability for people in that group to sign the record. So sometimes that person might not be available to actually sign and create work. So we would want to design queries or workspaces to pull in things that need my approval, but where we might need to be able to go and sign for other people's pre-approval work. Let me go to our plans. And so here we can also build out what work plans we want to attach, fairly similar to how it works in R3. Again, with that approval signature needed, we're putting some control over which work plans are actually being used.
Right, so versus using the on-demand event-based work in R3 where you would be tied to that particular event, this gives you some more flexibility.
Right. And so you would fill this out like you would if you were preparing a regular maintenance work order that's corrective, or if you were filling out what the activity would be on the event. Once you're done, you can save the record, and then the signatures would be applied to meet the approval.
Right.
Once the approvals are met, the workflow this record's using changes to the one we indicate in that field. And one thing I want to point out too is this is very powerful configuration, things that we didn't have in R3. And right now, I don't want to say we're limited in using it for the pre-approvals and others, but I'm really interested to see how whenever we open custom configurations, how customers want to be able to use this. Now we can indicate changes of workflows based off of certain signatures or status changes. So it's a really, really cool tool. I can't wait to see it get implemented elsewhere.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So we're not going to obviously walk through all of the stages here, just for interest of time. So that kind of gives you a good, I think, flavor and overview about how the the corrective work process could work by utilizing that request functionality. And again, we know that not everyone even uses work requests. But it's certainly there, available for you. And now with those pre-approval steps, hopefully will help enhance your use of the request functionality. So now we just want to move on and just talk a little bit about, from a preventative maintenance standpoint, just some of the things we highlighted in the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to open up a particular asset. In this case, it's a system record. It's our good old water for injection system, WFI 5000. So again, this is an asset record. It's a system. And, as Joe kind of pointed out again earlier, we pulled a lot of the information down that were under the menus down to the associated tabs here, particularly schedules. So in this case, let's look at what schedules exist or what events exist against this particular asset. So you can see here we have a maintenance event for a preventative maintenance on the distribution pump. And we already have the next due date set for the end of this month. It happens on a monthly basis. Okay, what we're calling now the basis field versus the
calculation source field.
Thank you. Calculation source field is still due date, so we're going to calculate the next due date off of the previous due date. And again, similar in R3, we still had the idea of a reminder date or reminder days where notifications can go out a certain number of days prior to this work being coming due. But finally, we'll come here and you'll see this is now the new feature I was highlighting earlier, this idea of grace days or a grace period. So I can go in here and I can say, well, we know September 30th is the due date, but I have some leeway here. It is a monthly PM, but I can get up to 5 days past the due date to be able to complete this work.
And then let's save the changes for that, Jason.
Now I'm going to go ahead here, and if I right click on the event, I can go ahead and add work. And again, you're not typically going to be manually generating work orders for scheduled work, but you certainly have the ability here to do that. So we're now going to create this work order.
And click on add in the top right corner, Jason. And so we had a question that we're about to answer right now.
Okay.
So two things that I want to point out in this maintenance work order is on the left-hand side, we're still in the planning tab. We we have due date, grace days, and it calculates what our end of grace period would be. On the right-hand side, we have a slider that is called update due date on work creation. Now, we can't modify that in the work because that information is coming from the event. We display it on the work order to give the user more information about what's going on with this work. But if you click on the icon next to the event name near the top, we'll talk about what that update due date does. So you want to go and maximize this real quick? Yeah. So the top right corner, we have update due date on work creation. And so this is an event by event choice. Whereas this was possible in R3, but it was a configuration choice. So it means that it was applicable to any record using that rule. However, in R4, we can determine on the event, does the due date get updated regardless of what has been done with the work? You know, if the work's uncompleted, this will still update the schedule to its next due date. So we really planned on this being utilized for maybe like daily routes. So something that you do perform each and every day, just because you missed it yesterday doesn't mean we can't create it today. You know, we're performing today's work, so you just cancel the old one, but the new one still gets created because its due date got updated on the schedule. Also for monthly, if something comes due once a month, every month, we can't perform what was supposed to be due last month. We've got to do what's this month. So depending on certain activities, that update due date on work creation might be applicable. You can go ahead and close out of this.
Okay, so we have our work order here, and we're going to talk through some of this, but one thing first we're going to do is we're going to move this to the next stage. So you can see here, this again is going to look very familiar. We can hold, cancel, move it to in progress. And again, a little different than the best practices of R3, we're no longer requiring a signature to move it from open to in progress. But again, the new stage here that we've added is this out for service that I mentioned earlier. I'm just going to transition this to in progress.
And the first
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jason.
No, you can.
First thing you notice is now our form view's changed. Maybe as a technician or a user, I don't need to see that planning information or due date. I want to go directly to the actual start date, when I said I started it, when I said I completed it, any additional cost, any pass-fail information. Also, Chris, this is for you. On the right-hand side, we'll see required templates completed. Currently, it is set to NA. This is an example of a virtual field, also referred to as a smart field. What this field is doing is it's looking at any measurement data templates, if it's calibration, or work plan templates. But since this is just maintenance, we'll talk about the work plans. So Jason, if you can click on the work plan tab. What it's saying is because we do not have required to complete checked as turned on, it's saying all the templates need to be completed, not applicable, because this is not required to be completed. If this was turned on, the required templates to be completed would actually be a blank field, because we will be using that field to control whether or not this record can progress forward. If all of the templates that are marked required to complete, so if I have multiple, maybe there's 3 templates, 2 of them are checked completed. Once those 2 that are marked required to complete are checked completed, if you go back to the results tab, Jason, it will populate that field with a yes, which allows the record to be transitioned to its next status, which would be one of the review stages. So again, maybe you'd want to build your queries around this. Is required templates completed empty? If so, those indicate work records where the templates still need to be completed against it. I don't know if this was brought up either, but we do have a different colored dot. There was the blue dot. The difference between the red dot is the red dot indicates that you need data in there in order to save the record. Blue dots indicate that data is required in order to progress the record forward. And that required templates completed is the same, it just is grayed out. You can't manually enter data in there. It evaluates your templates.
Okay, we're just going to quickly here open up this work plan template to kind of show you some of the changes and additions and how visually how it looks much different than what you're used to seeing in R3. So this is an example of a work plan template. So you can see here we have our different steps. We have 7 steps. And another, I guess, enhancement within the steps now is having sort of different views or different form views for the different steps. So Nick, you want to kind of talk through some of those?
Yeah, so the first step is what we refer to as the simplified with image step. So as you are developing your work plan templates, you can designate which step has which view. So maybe for this step, I want them to have an embedded image accompanying it. So go ahead and mark completed on this one, Jason, so that we can show when it's saved. The second one, the second step is just a simplified step. So for a lot of steps in work plans, it's just a mark completed, and we can capture any comments if required. Same for the third. The fourth step is actually a simple route design. What it is in this step, I can reference a specific asset that we checked in this step. So, if you're doing some sort of safety inspection, as you're going through your facility for each step, you would check the asset ID for maybe a fire extinguisher you have in your system or whatever is along your route. And so we would expect several of these design route steps to be in here, but right now we only have one, for example. Finally, we have the last step, which is just requires a criteria. So it'll evaluate the expected value to the actual results. There are other form views such as between and other simplified, but these are just a handful that we wanted to show you. You can make each step unique to it. So go ahead and click Save, Jason.
And here you'll notice we saved it really just because we wanted to highlight. You can see how when the step was completed, it gave me a date timestamp and the individual who completed the step.
And Charles, that is yes. So if you want them to be able to embed a document or an image, those are the ones. So now if there was an attachment field, so if you wanted to add any sort of generic, PDF or Excel, you can add that for each step.
Okay, and then just finally what we wanted to kind of spend a few minutes on was the parts feature. So again, just highlighting this ability to add queries directly to my workspace very easily. I just clicked on the plus sign, I looked for all parts, and now I've got my all parts list query. So you can see here I have a couple of different parts. In this case, I was able to embed an image as well into the query. So I'm just going to open up this parts record, and we just want to show a couple of quick things here, as I know we're running a little bit tight on time. So, I think some most important stuff here, again, here you can see the embedded image. Being able to easily access quantity available, average cost. You can see here if I go to store details, and Nick, you jump in here and kind of.
Those again are, the virtual smart fields that we've been mentioning, where it pulls information that might be located on the store details and it brings it up to the main summary. The other new tab would be bill of materials. So this is where I can manage what assets this part record belongs to. So very critical use is maybe you're making this part obsolete and you want to make sure it's removed from all assets bill of materials. So you can go in here and remove it. Also, if this is being referenced in events, Jason, if you click on the menu in the top left corner, you can see the event plan parts. So this will show you all the events where this is being used for work. And then finally, well, not finally, but next we've kind of brought together both the like for like and part functionality. So whenever we want to insert a new part that it might replace or it might be replaced by, we're essentially creating a like for like part, and it's indicating that this distribution pump 4 is an acceptable replacement, and it's also an acceptable replacement for that part as well. So this is an example of an interchangeable. It doesn't have to be. You know, one can be an acceptable substitute for another, but not necessarily the other way. For this example, we just want to show we have 2 part pump records. They're interchangeable. It doesn't have to be interchangeable.
And with that, we can open it up for questions, maybe just for a couple of minutes. And thank you so much for everyone's time and attention.
Thank you, Jason and Nick. Just yeah, certainly if you have questions for Jason or Nick, feel free to type them in, or you can go ahead and unmute your microphone. Thanks to the Blue Mountain team, certainly for keeping up with the questions in the chat. I don't think we need to, I think the majority of those have been answered already, and those are in the public chat window for anyone to see those. So we'll just give it a few seconds here before we move on. If anybody has any specific questions for Jason or Nick.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Anvesh from Kite Pharma. So quick question on condition monitoring capabilities, right? So typically, on work orders, or especially on an asset, you can define meters and thresholds, right? So when you create a work order on those assets, when the technician goes and take measurements, if those measurements happen to fall out of the threshold, will the system automatically read that and generate corrective maintenance work orders? Kind of your typical condition monitoring capabilities. Is it something that's part of R4?
So Anvish, we continue to have the meter-based scheduling option as we do in R3. So the scenario that you're describing, I think, really would involve a combination of the work plan template, which would say, take this reading and enter this value to the meter. And then as long as you set up the events that would be triggered from the meter reading, which they'd be events and they would be scheduled in a sense, but they're really triggered based on a condition, that'll work very much the same way that it does in R3 today. That those will, as soon as those thresholds are met, those work records will generate for that in the next time the automation runs.
Okay. So in addition to the existing events, we'd have to create, additional events that are tied to meters, so that if the readings are out of tolerance, the certain conditions are met, then the work orders are created automatically. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't have to, although you may want to. When you schedule the event, you have to choose one or the other, meter-based or date-based. Okay. The reason you might want to set up like a parallel event would be if you wanted to type it as corrective, as opposed to preventative, which typically you're scheduled, that's your PMs typically. So you can have some different options of how you describe it by default when it kicks out. Or maybe you do almost the same thing that you do with the PM, but you want to have something that's scheduled monthly or quarterly, but also something else that kicks out, whenever these thresholds are met. So it really comes down to what makes the most sense of how you kind of want what the end result to look like.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a great question.
I have another question if you have time. If not, then I can probably circle back later.
Go for it.
Yeah,
Okay.
go for it. Yeah.
So in terms of the workflows, right? I was wondering if there was any sort of automation capabilities, right? So from the presentation, you know, when you create a work request, you want to generate a work order, you know, there's an option to select a workflow. So that means there's a manual process involved where the coordinator is actually selecting from the available workflows. I've kind of seen situations where that's automated. So depending on certain predefined criteria, so it could be maybe asset classification, or it could be some other attributes on the asset. If the coordinator says, I want to create a work order, it automatically gets routed to the appropriate workflow behind the scenes. So you're kind of, you know, nobody is actually manually selecting a workflow. It's sort of automated.
Yeah.
And it gets pushed into a workflow.
It's a
I'm
good
just curious to see if that's
Yeah.
something that's possible.
It's a great question. We've got asked that over the years, and it's while we can't do it initially, you can envision it would involve some kind of matrix that you would indicate kind of what are these conditions that say default it to this particular type of workflow. But what we have built into when we do these automations where it may have been a little subtle when it happened there, but when we did the pre-approval of the work order, yes, there was a manual selection to say these are the reviews that I want. But we're doing that in the context of something that the planning group is saying, hey, this is truly a GMP work record, and I do want 2 or 3 levels of review. And when they commit that change, there's actually another review of that before that's ever approved. And then once it does get approved, there is an automatic rerouting down that workflow. So it's not quite exactly what you're asking for. We have heard what you've asked for in the past, and at least initially we won't have that available, but definitely with the platform, there's a lot of more possibilities available to us.
Cool. Thanks, Kate.
Yep.
I'm good. Thank you, guys.
I'm sorry, this is Beth Burgess. I see the questions that came in from Charles and Jonathan's response about the option on the event record to update the due date on creation. If this is set, the due date and the schedule will update as soon as the work record is created, which would allow another instance of work to generate. So really, to oversimplify, we really can have multiple records open on the one schedule now in R4?
So generally that option would be done for if it's daily work. So if this is a route that you perform daily, just because for whatever reason yesterday's wasn't closed out in time, we don't want to prevent the due date updating for the next interval and then subsequently can't do work for today's. It will essentially create multiple work orders for the same schedule, but it would just be one interval out, regardless of whether or not the first work order is completed.
And Beth, I would say the difference from today is that even today in R3, we have this capability, but it's embedded in the workflow only. So the answer would have been, well, you create another workflow that updates the due date on creation as opposed to when it's completed or reviewed. So those latter options are still built into the base workflows of R4. So that'll still, in fact, actually we give you 2 options when we set you up to say, hey, do you want it to recalculate when the technician completes it or when the reviewer reviews it? So you get to choose there. But then there's a third option now, which is really, we envision it for this daily work scenario. Although users are going to use it how they choose. What it allows you to do is just override that and say, hey, when I create this, let's say it's daily, I don't care if the technician didn't close it out. I want to create the next one and the next one. We just make that, allow you to do that without having a custom workflow to accomplish it.
And Keith, just to, this is something I know I've discussed with you guys in regards to this particular activity. whether it's daily, weekly, or in a lot of instances, I don't care if it's yearly. I'm saying that even if the previous work order isn't closed, I should still be generating the next work order because I'm saying we do an annual PM or we do a semi-annual PM. Because the technician or somebody forgot about that work order, that means another work order isn't going to generate and we'll continue just not seeing the work. I'd rather see the work and miss one work order than not have other work orders generate.
Yeah, so that option's there. And I guess the caution that would give you on that is there with a work order, there's the ability to close or cancel it. And I believe we actually embed rights around that to do that. Because if you did do that and you had this rolling forward the due dates, you had the potential for missing something in between there. So which is the reason that's rights control to cancel those. So you have to take those things into consideration if you're going to use that in that way. But the option is yours when you implement. You get to choose how or if to use that particular capability.
I have another question if we have time.
Sure, what's your question, Anvesh?
So again, going back to the workflows, again, as staying on the automation team, when the work order goes through certain phases of life, the workflows are able to evaluate the conditions and automatically change the status. As an example, if there's parts planned on a work order, but the part is not available, I've seen situations where the status of the work order automatically goes to waiting for material, right? And then once the part has been received and it gets issued, the status changes to waiting scheduling. So there are certain statuses which are based on the conditions. It automatically changes on the work order. Is that something that is a possibility in R4?
That's an interesting question. I believe what you're asking is a possibility. Now, it won't be built into the best practices template workflows, the out-of-the-box workflows. But what you're describing would, and again, Nick and Jonathan steer me right if I'm not correct here, but through an automation in R4, we're calling they're termed automations, and they're actually used throughout. And they're what occurs after a signature is applied in R4 to move it to the next state, or when a work order is approved to reassign it to a workflow, a new workflow. We refer to those as automations. A custom automation in this case could meet that need to say, hey, once this moves to the open or in progress stage, perhaps look at your parts to see if they're at their reorder, well, not at the reorder point, but if there's any available. If there's not, then move it to some other stage, such as waiting for parts.
Right, and so my follow-up question, and normally whenever we're talking custom configuration, statuses and stages, is first evaluate, do you need a new stage? Do you need to change the rights around who can interact with the record, what stages it goes in, what stages it go out of, or could we use a virtual field and queries to help organize that information? And a lot of times, whenever you keep that in consideration, the more stages we enter and the more automation we build around that, the more rights or transitions, that's going to cause the PQ time and configuration to vastly grow and grow, but sometimes maybe just using a virtual field to evaluate that and then accompanied with queries to separate that work out can sometimes solve it as well. But
yeah,
with automation, there's a lot more possible.
Yeah.
Back to your original question, can it assign a workflow without us even manually entering it? And my answer to that is define the criteria and capture the criteria on the record, and yeah, we can do that.
These are great questions, and definitely just in honor of time here, I think we should save some of them for our breakout session this afternoon after the last session here today. But thank you everyone for the great questions, and thanks to the Blue Mountain team for helping to keep up with the questions via chat. Thanks, Jason and Nick. Great presentation. We appreciate it.